Praise be Jesus Christ. My name is Father Jim Hutchins. I am a retired diocesan priest from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and I'm here in my retirement home, and I'm preaching on the fifth Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle C. A note before I begin. In line with my homily this week, I mentioned the catching of fish, in response to the gospel. I recommend Word on Fire's new book about drawing children, young adult children, back to their faith. The book is called Return. Go to, quotes, books.wordonfire.org. No spaces and no capitals. There is free shipping. This book takes the stance that wait and see is not working. We must do something positive to help our children return to the faith. Tell your friends about this book. Let us not sit back and wait. I just ordered 5 copies for my relatives and friends. They came and filled both boats so that the boats were in danger of sinking. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus told Simon Peter, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." That was also the goal of Vatican Council II, and it is, of course, the goal of the Church, saving souls. Aggiornamento, updating, which was supposedly the model or the key word of the Vatican Council. After 60 years, we realize it has not worked. From a time before the council when about 80% of Catholics were going regularly to Mass, we have arrived at a time now when about 17% of Catholics in the United States are going to church every Sunday. It's time to stop with the big, gigantic national celebrations aimed at the already converted and start working at the parish level, which would also be a lot less expensive, working to bring souls back to Christ. The liturgy is where the faithful experience church up close and personal. Changes need to be made at the parish level, where conversion takes place. Corpus Christi processions, for instance, at the local level, are what built up belief in the real presence in the Eucharist. And to boot, aggiornamento, dating, was not a statement of policy by Pope John the 23rd. It was simply an off-the-cuff remark which the media magnified for its own purposes. It's like, I told you so. See, we told you the church was behind the times and it needs to be updated. The updating that affected most Catholics was the so-called updating of the liturgy. I say so-called because the council did not call for an updating of the liturgy. All the bishops voted to retain the Latin liturgy, Gregorian chant, classic polyphonic music, and the organ were meant to be restored. What was done by those supposedly implementing the decrees on the liturgy of the council was not what the bishops voted for. Would someone please get this message to Pope Francis? The world, of course, adores updating. It adores technology, which is the essence of updating. It's something new every day. Day to day things are invented. More and more new things, things that help us with comfort and quickness and get things done, in an easier fashion. But we overvalue what we think is new just because it is new. We overvalue the comfort these new things are supposed to bring. Both new and old, of course, things have both benefits and disadvantages. It's the way we use them. They can be embraced only if they lead us more safely and swiftly on our journey to heaven. What does it matter if China has invented a new uh, uh, AI system that is better than anything in the US so far? What truly matters is how far mankind in any nation has progressed toward the ultimate goal, named by St. Augustine, of resting our heart in the Lord. A little more than a year ago, I wanted to dip my toe into the pool of the traditional, that is, the traditional Latin Mass, to see whether it was inviting me to dive back in. And I wanted to see if the waters of the traditional were as inviting as the waters of the present. And they were, and even more so. When I was in the seminary in the 60s, we took the Latin Mass for granted until Vatican II. And then we too thought something new would be somehow better. Sad thing is that the history and beauty of the Latin liturgy was never taught to us, its origins and how it came to be. That gap set us up, therefore, for looking for the new because we were never taught to appreciate the old. It's just now that I am catching up all the depth hidden in these waters from the past. That has prompted me to share with you what I have found. Perhaps you too will find inviting what I have found inviting. In a matter of a handful of years, the ancient form of the Mass in Latin, which took centuries to develop, was tossed out the proverbial window in a couple years. Uh, Pope St. John the 23rd supposedly opened the window. It said, he said, to let the fresh air in. Uh, did we really need that? Okay. Pope St. Paul VI, who followed Pope St. John the 23rd, put in charge, perhaps unknowingly, a cardinal who had his own and not the council's agenda. Since St. Pope Paul VI was close to death, the cardinal was able to do an end run around him. For what purpose? Well, it seems that Pope John 23rd's emphasis on ecumenism was what motivated this cardinal. He wanted to somehow create a liturgy that would be acceptable to Protestants and would foster their reunion to the one true Catholic Church. But he threw the baby out with the bathwater. Changing the liturgy was not on the agenda of Vatican Council II, as I mentioned above. Communion, standing up and receiving in the hand, was not on the agenda of Vatican II. Synodality was not on the agenda of Vatican II, no matter what Pope Francis says. The cardinal in charge of this new liturgy went so far as to have Protestant pastors sit in on the meeting where the new liturgy was put together. That was going too far. Later, it was found that the cardinal lied about having Protestant pastors in on the revamping of the liturgy. He said they were there just to observe. One of the Protestant pastors, however, revealed the truth. They said they did contribute to the new liturgy. What was successful as a step towards reunion was the revamping of the liturgy of the Word. Both Catholic and Protestant churches now follow the same plan of sequential readings of the Scriptures. And this is the more ancient practice of the church, which was a continuous of the ancient practice of the synagogue. What was not successful was the revamping of what began to be called the liturgy of the Eucharist. Surely by now we must acknowledge that the hopes and dreams the inventors of this new liturgy had have vanished in thin air. In the United States, as I said above, the pews are emptying. So it would behoove us to ask, where, if any place, are the pews filling back up? And the answer is parishes with the traditional Latin Mass. Who was attending? Answer, young families with a lot of kids. And we stand back mystified as, what is it about the Latin Mass that attracts them? We ask because we were never taught the beauty of the old. So we have some catching up to do. It's like parents learning too late that their kids need parental boundaries, not parental friends, trying to please the children all the time. This is a trend which I believe will lead to a real movement back to the ancient liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church. It's approximately 1,500 years old, and the new liturgy was made in a couple of years. It just doesn't sound right. Not too long ago, believe it or not, I had a young man who was serving my daily mass tell me how excited he was to go to the Latin Mass. He didn't understand at the time. Sadly, Pope Francis, for the present, has actually blocked the expansion of the ancient Latin Mass, which has begun to do what was supposed to have been done by the updating of the Mass at Vatican Council. Right after the Council, Bishop Lefebvre embraced the true teaching of the Council by continuing the celebration of the ancient liturgy. Recently, in a diocese in France where the Archbishop made a similar move by leading his diocese back to the traditional Latin liturgy, the pews did fill up, and seminaries saw an increase of vocations. Pope Francis, disappointingly, then dismissed this bishop and appointed someone more to his liking. This move of Pope Francis, along with many other moves away from the ancient liturgy, and even more sadly, also away from the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church, has fulfilled the prophecy made by several mystics and by our Blessed Mother herself in an apparition. The prophecy, all of them were about apostasy, which would happen right at the top in Rome. There is another factor involved in the emptying of the pews, which has moved people to the traditional Latin Mass. One of the long-time goals of the liturgical movement, which began long before Vatican Council II, was to foster active participation. Active participation, however, has become too active. Seems as if we faithful are not doing something or saying something at every moment of the new Mass. And if we're not actively participating. That's the thought. It's wrong, but that's the thought. What is the definition of true definition of active participation? Well, first of all, it must involve body, soul, and mind. Pope Benedict XVI gave what I think is the proper and deeper, but perhaps less evident definition of active participation. He defined active participation as living in our lives the death and resurrection of Christ, which we celebrate at the Mass. We become what we celebrate. If we are singing with all our might, but not changing our lives, we are not actively participating at Mass. Mass isn't changing our lives. Participation affects both the soul as well as the body. That is why Pope Benedict XVI and others have also emphasized the need for silence during the liturgy. There must be a time for our souls to silently absorb the mysteries we are celebrating. We can't be on the move all the time at Mass. We tell our kids to sit still at Mass, but we too have to sit still. We have to make our hearts and minds and souls sit still and let the movement of grace quietly enter our souls at Mass. In the traditional Latin Mass, the Eucharistic prayer is said in a low voice, inaudible to the faithful. To understand why, picture the scene at the cross. Those who loved the Lord stood there, helpless and silently praying, while Jesus hung on the cross in this monumental act of redemption. There was nothing that they could do but silently pray, because redemption could only be done by Christ. And so the Eucharistic prayer becomes the representation in sacramental form of that scene at the foot of the cross. The priest, as the altar Christus, affects the representation in sacramental form. It is something only the ordained priest can do. We, the faithful, in silence and awe, silently kneel in adoration during the consecration of the Mass, as those at the cross had silently stood and prayed. Something is being done for us that we could not do for ourselves. And that's the reasoning for the priest saying something in a low voice, and we sort of stand gazing in adoration at what is being done for us. In the past, we said the rosary during the quiet times during the Latin Mass. We did not have to hear the words the priest was praying or make the responses. We knew by faith what he was saying and doing and what was happening. Our rosaries reminded us of the very mysteries that we were celebrating at Mass. So they went hand in hand. It wasn't something that wasn't a part of the Mass. In the Old Testament temple liturgy, which was the origin of the Latin liturgy, only the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, and that only once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The people were gathered in the courtyard outside, saying their own prayers. Sound like what was done at the Latin Mass. The point of this arrangement is that they realized that the high priest was doing something for them that they could not do for themselves. And that is the very meaning of the word liturgy, something that is done for us that we cannot do for ourselves. I think it was the centurion, one of the centurions in Capernaum, built a synagogue for the Jews because they could not do it for themselves. We cannot do redemption for ourselves. And so this setup is the realization of that mystery of our faith that is meant to be conveyed to us as in the past, silently prayed during the Eucharistic prayer. It is a mirror image of the priest in the Holy of Holies and the people in the courtyard of the temple. When churches were able to be built in the 4th century after the Roman persecutions, they were built imitating the temple in Jerusalem. God said the temple must be built facing the east, the place of the rising sun, which in the New Testament was also named as the place of the second coming of Christ, according to the book of Revelation. So churches were, if at all possible, built facing the east. Ad orientem is the Latin phrase for this. Churches were built also with sanctuaries, in imitation of the Holy of Holies, in which only the priest was allowed to enter, along with those serving the Mass. Before entering the Holy of Holies, the priest was required to cleanse himself in a bath called the mikvah before entering. And so he purified himself of sin to enter into the presence of the sinless one. This bath, this cleansing, is what we do at the very beginning of the Mass, in both New and Old liturgies, when we confess our sorrow for our sins. It's an act of humility, and there's no finer way, there's no finer invitation to the Lord to come to us than to perform that act of humility. It draws him to us. The church, the altar, the priest, and the people all faced the same direction. They faced the east, signifying that they were all journeying together on their way to heaven. The church is where heaven and earth are joined together before the second coming in the celebration of the Mass. The sanctuary, in imitation of the Holy of Holies, was set off from the rest of the church, the courtyard, by the use of an altar rail. The altar rail is where the altar comes to the people. Jesus is always, the sign of that is Jesus is always the one to make the first move. He has always come to us before we have come to him. He comes to us even before we think of coming to him. Benedict XVI wrote that having the priest facing the people is to create a closed circle in which the focus is on us. We're all looking at each other, not on God. Priest and people facing the east, however, focus on God, who invites all of us to the heavenly banquet. The word holy in Latin is sanctus, and it means separated. We separate things that are most precious to us, like the good china that's only taken out of the cabinet on holidays, like the special seats at events where only dignitaries sit, like our taking the last seat at the table as an act of humility and waiting for the Lord to invite us up higher. Perhaps some humility about entering the Holy of Holies is in order today. My motivation for presenting this explanation of the liturgy was prompted by those who expressed appreciation at a Mass I recently celebrated, in which, before the Mass, I offered some explanation of the liturgy. And they expressed afterwards their appreciation. Just as in the past, when we never thought to explain the Latin Mass because it was taken for granted that everyone already understood, so today we might be facing the same situation. We simply don't understand the ancient liturgy or the beauty of the ancient liturgy. So I will continue speaking in my homilies for the next several weeks about the Mass and what it means.